weird that there's only two. We'll see. All right.
That's surprising to me. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Connecting to audio.
Eric is coming.
Nice.
Hello.
Hey, Simon.
Hey, Simon.
You're still dealing with the Zoom user.
This one I can say, right? So I signed up with Apple. I got hide my email, and you can't change the setting on the phone. You have to log in, and it was crashing on my iPad. So I'm like, I'll get my laptop out after this, and I'll try it. But also, technology just baffles me. I get other people to do it. Basically, I should do something else. Like, I don't know, write poems or something.
Hey, folks.
Hey,
How's
Eric,
everybody
how's it
doing?
going? Long
Hey,
time no chat.
Hey. Paul, welcome back.
No, maybe I should go landscape.
Olivier, which Olivier is that? Is that Olivier Boulweric?
Bulveric, yes, it's me.
Hey, long
The
time no
French.
chat.
Yes.
Well, JGP is also representing the French, so
Yeah, we
Yes,
have
I agree. Yeah.
we have our quota of French people here now. So okay.
So yeah, I mean, while we're waiting as other people are joining and stuff, I thought this topic was something that just keeps coming up. People just keep asking me over and over about what my thoughts are on generative AI. So I wanted to get other people's thoughts, right? I don't want to be the loudest voice in the room on this because my answer is it terrifies me because I don't think we're doing good enough data quality. So outside of that, I think it's a slippery slope. So I wanted to turn it over. JGP, do you have thoughts or questions that you wanted to kind of run through on this? And howdy, Paul. I haven't said that yet. Yeah, I saw you dropped and came back. So
yeah, quick issues. Thanks.
So I have some. I would say I'm probably biased. Speaking of AI, but the thing is, I know that Eric has a great story to tell us about GenAI on data mesh. So maybe we should let him talk.
Sure. Sure.
But not too long, okay? Because
Yeah, not too long. I'll try and be very brief. So we're in the middle of probably doing 3 data mesh projects right now in my company. The one I can talk about is we're an international global nonprofit around climate data. But if you extrapolate a little bit, you can kind of guess what my paying clients are actually doing. But the bottom line is the mission we have with this climate organization is to make climate data easy to find, consume, share, and trust. And it's exactly the opposite today. And we're using data mesh specifically because at the end of the day, the owners of the data in the climate landscape are not under one organization, that are under one governance mechanisms. They're all distributed. NASA doesn't report to NOAA, doesn't report to OECD, et cetera. They're all independent organizations. And the problem that we have is if we want to bring all that data together, they're busy doing other things. So how do we actually get these folks to participate in this data mesh? And the interesting thing is we landed on generative AI. There's a variety of other areas that we use it, but the simplest one is when we have a data product and we want to bring it into the data mesh, the very first thing to do is envision your marketplace and you have a tile. That tile is the data product. The very first thing we do is we actually scrape the website, their base website, to understand who the organization is. We summarize it. Then we scrape the data site and we summarize that. And we also use GenAI to summarize it, but also to generate the tags. And all of that gets put into the data product, the registry, if you will, of data products, and they're surfaced through our marketplace in a tile. So immediately onboarding a data product, which used to be a difficult exercise, somebody would have to spend time convincing this organization to do some work, then having somebody actually fill it out in the format we need. Now it happens literally in 5 seconds. Now, once we have that, we actually can do natural language search. So now that you have many data products out there in our marketplace, how do I actually find them? Well, the old way we do is keyword search. And that kind of works, but natural language search is much easier. So all of that information that I talked about, the summarized, the raw data, we actually store in a vector database. And in the vector database, it's just, we translate all that text into embeddings. And then at that point in time, we can do searches, and we can use that as context for GPT queries. And lo and behold, we can actually provide natural language search. So that's that's a few of the basics. The other stuff we use it for is to create, with a simple command, create a knowledge graph of all this cool stuff where the nodes are topics, and so it identifies the topics. It shows the relationship between the two. So not only do we go from tags, we go to taxonomies, and we go to knowledge graphs. And then every time we ingest a new data product, we run it against our taxonomy, and lo and behold, it maps it, tags it, etc. So what we found is generative AI allows us to get to an end state much quicker than we otherwise would.
So that's the case of sorry, Simon, you had something to say. So
Yeah, so I saw a very interesting initial experiment recently, which I won't really particularly talk about, but who and the what. But they basically took, they start off with like 40, I think it's like 40 gigabytes of high quality information they had pertaining to all the business contracts, commercials, of everything to do with what the data mesh was fundamentally doing. They loaded it into Azure, where they were already on Azure, and they trained a specific, they used the OpenAI APIs in Azure, and they trained this, extra layers of the LLM. And then they could basically sort of ask questions, tell me about the share class distributions of the this, that, and the other fund. And the model would come back and basically say, exactly what was going on, what the contracts, what the legals were. And it would also give links to the underlying source. And obviously then people say, well, what about safety? Was this going to start saying something it shouldn't be saying, right? And so then it would basically, it was demonstrated by the data scientist who was doing this experiment, improving the capabilities, investigating this. So if you ask it, well, who's the president of the United States? It would say, I'm sorry, that's outside my context. So it would only answer questions that were in the 40 gigabytes of all legal groups. I'm being very graciously attacked by this cockapoo dog. So if I'm slightly distracted, it's because Toffee would like a cuddle. And I was like, well, this is really amazing. What else can you do with it? And so with the APIs they actually had, they had the ability to plug in agents that would go and do anything else you wanted to do. So you could start asking questions about the free text search, and you give all the context of all the contractuals, to which are great stuff about the data, all this data in the data mesh was about all this. But then what they could demonstrate is say, well, I can plug in an agent here. So if it recognizes, hey, I'm asking a specific question, go do something else. And there's examples of agents like go look at Wikipedia, do whatever. But one thing they might be able to do is pull out the parameters of parse the question, and then drop in any machine learning they wanted to do. So the feasibility study was like, well, people have machine learning models that take natural language text and turn them into SQL queries. So the next level would be say, okay, if I want to ask a question and we can detect that question saying, tell me what's happened with my funds since the Russell rebalance, then the natural language model would basically, hope the potential would be find out what you're asking and then go, okay, well, that one I'm going to plug it into this particular piece of code in Python. And that one's going to go, okay, I'm going to try and generate a SQL query, run against the data mesh and get the data back. I saw a really interesting video about, what's coming up in ChatGPT, early preview. I don't have the reference, I was going to look it up. But Jen was looking at the APIs, and he demonstrated, well, if I took a spreadsheet of some data, and I think it was, some national data set, he uploaded into ChatGPT the new, preview commercial version. And he said, could you tell me any abnormalities or anything interesting or any key significant dates in this data? And ChatGPT said, so yes, from this point, if you draw, from this point in time, something happened to this data. There's been a change since 1958. And he could also on this demonstration video say, could you plot me a graph of this? And the ChatGPT new engine was able to plot a graph from the data. So this was just mind blowing. I'm like, okay, this clearly is going to be an amazing way of people in making inquiries that you can pull off to the data, pull the parameters and pull for the data, ask it to visualize the data in the data mesh, and search for, tell me all the context of this data. What's the legals? What's the contractuals? What's going on? So yeah, I think it's going to be an amazing inquiry tool to sort of jet power getting into the data, visualizing the data, finding what's new in the data, understanding how to query the data.
Scott?
Yeah. So, Eric, one thing you were talking about in there that I heard was missing was you kept talking about this is search, but it wasn't necessarily answering complex questions. And Simon, you were what you were talking about was getting more complex, but like that's the question I have is, are people using this to make it so that they get pointed in the right direction and then do their homework, or is it the other thing? So I wanted to hear Eric specifically from that, and then Simon would love to hear that. And then Julia, I really want to hear how customers are constantly probably pinging you on all this stuff. But Eric, I wanted to hear specifically, what are you staying away from? What are you worried about at the start to prevent people from going down bad paths?
Yeah, so the way we so first off, we ingest a bunch of data, we keep that in our vector database, and we use a search of the vector database to provide context that we use with the prompt that goes into either open source, OpenAI. So what we say in the prompt effectively is only use this data to answer your question. And if you don't have the answer, say, I don't know, some version of that. So what ends up happening is we ask questions. The simplest one is, find me a data product that has precipitation for France. Okay. And we have data products that explain what that we actually have that information, and we use the natural language search to make it really easy to find it. But we use our vector database and using that to create the context to make sure it only searches for the information using the information that we actually want it to actually search. Now, the beautiful thing about that is what you're using is the ability of GPT or generative AI to express the answer, but the content of the answer and the source of the answer and the reference of the answer, we can be confident it's not hallucination because it's the information that we actually provided to it.
So you're using GenAI to both create the data product and then search it. And
yeah, there's a multi-level process. We use it at the front end to scrape the website, create the content, and then summarize it, tag it, knowledge graph, etc. Once it's in there, it's in our vector database. Then we issue natural language search queries, and the way it's recommended, it's a standard architecture pattern within GenAI. But you have your query, you do get me similar information in my vector database to this query, and then you use that as the context with a prompt that says only use this information. So it's a two-step process, but what it gives us is a very rich, relevant, and non-hallucinatory, I suppose if that's a word, response.
And so Simon, you're only using it for discovery. Did I understand that correctly?
No, I was going more than that. So I think that very specifically, and we hadn't finished doing this demonstration, but the proposition I want to go for is I as a client log in. So we're talking about large financial institutions dealing with other financial institutions, generating huge amounts of data that's in a data mesh. And then, one of the really expensive things that happen is somebody says, could you explain please what's going on, or and trying to the data is now available to these institutional clients, but they have like a tricky question. They don't really understand the specialist context or how to frame the question or have direct access to the systems or understand how to write a report or anything else. So they pick up a phone, they talk to their person, they get a high priority interrupt. Sales asks operations should drop everything and answer this question for the key person. It's incredibly expensive, right? And so they're trying to basically get the data served up to the client every which way they possibly can. Self-serve reporting, canned reports, APIs, everything. But you still need an expert to take that question and go query the database, right? or data expert who says, no, you're mistaken, sir, because you don't understand the share class distribution on the Class B bonds. You're new at your company. You're seeing an abnormality because you don't understand the contractuals, right? So what they want is basically to have the chat thing with someone just ask the question, what is going on with my stocks and shares since this date? And then for that to basically, to extract the things, he's asking about his fund, he's asking about this information, this data set. But rather than expecting the natural language model to then run the query, it's like we will understand the question and answer questions in context like a helpful assistant, but then drop down into you can plug in any Python you want to answer the question, right? So with the API, you can plug in that if it's going down this path, the LLM can now, you can have plug in, go run this other search query, a SQL query, run this other vector query, run anything you want to do to answer the question. And very specifically, so I'm sorry, I'm talking for a long time, but everybody's worried about this idea of hallucinating, right? That it's saying something crazy that's outside the context. And I think we're being exposed to the very raw LLMs to sort of get the feedback of what is going wrong. But I think, if you're asking it something specific about getting the data and it won't answer context outside the data, then I think it's going to show the evidence, right? It's going to say, this is what my primary source is. This is what I'm trying to do. So I see it as an incredible tool to allow somebody who understands what they want. They just don't know how to type the query. They don't have access to run the query on the data store, but they can say what they want, and the LLM can basically parse that information, explain some context, and then say, okay, that's the query I'm going to run some Python code, and I'll pull back a data set. Here's your spreadsheet of information you inquired from. But more importantly, you can also say, give it a spreadsheet, and you can say, tell me abnormalities. So I don't ask I use Bard and ChatGPT. I don't ask it to extrapolate, make something up, right? I ask it to summarize, give this information, summarize it for me, right? And in particular, I always ask it the question, summarize this, but also can you tell me some points that are unexpected in this information? So it does a good job of summarizing it. And then it points up some codes like, in these articles, something you might not have caught or is interesting about the articles are these facts, right? And I think, well, then I check the facts, right? I check the summary, I check the facts. So I think if you use it as a primary source, you might get caught out. But as a way of summarizing information and asking it for showing some highlights and unexpected, I think it's a very powerful tool.
It
And
sounds
you need
like
the data. You need the data behind it, right? You need a data set that it can inquire and give you the data. Yeah.
Oh, and Yulia, I saw you nodding your head pretty strongly on a couple of points. So somewhat laughing, somewhat like I saw the exasperation phase too of somebody who's run across this. So what are you thinking there?
So first of all, I want to say kudos to Eric, because the use case with implementing data mesh and adding LLM model is just incredible. This is a perfect use case because, I was thinking about use cases where you can implement AI into data mesh. And I mean, it's kind of hard because it's not straightforward. What I find most useful with AI is helping people. Like the brilliant case is Copilot, right? When writing the code, because like data engineers, software engineers are just in love with it. But there are also, how do you say it, like drawbacks, because what was used behind, right? Intellectual property. And this part is tricky because it's not regulated yet, right? And I guess in the future, we should be able to extract the data that was used behind to train those models if people want so. And there is no mechanism or techniques to do so yet. So this is kind of things to consider. It's not the case for every model, obviously. But in our case at Masthead, so we implemented AI to help data engineers to improve their models and SQL queries and basically pipelines. So again, it's all the most use cases I see is to how to enhance the code the SQL query, like when it comes to collaborating with people. But this Eric's case on extracting and scraping the data and actually pulling it to organize data mesh is just brilliant. Yeah. So this is my take on it.
And
Thank you.
JGP.
And now Eric is blushing. We can't do that.
Well, because can you name any other case like this? I haven't heard. You know what? I was Googling before. Like I was asking Google, is there any case that I know? No yet. So Eric, you should put the blog post together. You're
Well,
gonna be
I'm not going to take that. Jean-Georges and I are going to be publishing a book relatively soon.
Okay,
And,
okay. You see, so it's more
And
than
sorry for that. We're not trying to do the big reveal here today, but that is one of our chapters, which is data mesh and generative AI. So.
We
I wanted to sign
are
it.
no friends.
Eric, I needed to sign it. Okay.
Well, I would love to give you some chapters for your review. That's fantastic. But we got even more. We got even more ideas, but that's just touching the surface.
I'm excited.
JGP, I wanted to hear from you because you put a bunch of this stuff into production with a bunch of pretty advanced people around data, right? So, like, how much do we need on guardrails? How much have you seen people go wrong by misinterpreting the wrong things? Like, how much of this is pre-canned where you can ask these 7 questions versus I want to go spelunking and kind of what Simon was talking about of tell me something interesting, but do you want it to go, tell me something interesting about this data I just provided you, or tell me something interesting. And it's like, the flying spaghetti monster, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, where there's a very strong correlation between the number of pirates in the world and the temperature, the global temperatures. And so it's like, as the number of pirates go down, global temperatures go up. So JGP, I wanted to hear kind of how you saw that. And then Simon, we'll get you, but I wanted to hear your actual thing and where you see the guardrails needed.
Well, I haven't connected any Gen AI to a data mesh specifically. Okay, so that's where it's really, really, really interesting. And so what I was thinking, and that's why I love to learn from Simon and Eric on that part, is how do you contextualize that? I think this is where data mesh is great, is because you're already within the domain, right? You're already because your data product is reflecting your domain. So if you design your domain correctly, then your Gen AI is going to be reflecting that. So when you're doing data exploration, like Simon was doing, like was talking, it's interesting. Now regarding the guardrails, I think this is where policies should be coming in, okay? And do you give access to anyone to that, or just your data scientists that can actually consume the data and can use some kind of a activator or facilitator using Gen AI for query?
How do you balance tools versus training? Like, that's another question that just keeps coming up to mind of like, do you make it so that the people can actually leverage this appropriately, or do you try and do you try and box everybody in so that they don't run across anything? So Simon, I know you wanted to add some stuff. That's been running through my head.
Yeah, so I didn't see this go to production. It was early days, but it was a live fire banking scenario on private cloud with zero public connectivity. Mm-hmm. Where they put this data in. And the way it was described to me by the data scientists, it's trained some extra layers. So it had all the initial baseline thing to understand what you're asking, to understand human, to understand information. But then it goes through that last layers to basically, well, this is the result and where I'm going to get it from. And if you ask it the questions outside of your training set, it would refuse to answer the question because it could detect, right? So if you ask it, who is the president of the United States, which is a demo, or ask anyone else, it understood the question. Somewhere in the base model, there is the answer, but the way it was under, it would say, I cannot answer that question because it's outside of my context. So it had all so it's like you've trained this machine so it can understand you like an 8-year-old, but if you ask it anything about the world, it says, I don't understand, I understand the textbook in front of me. So So it seems to be that sort of safety factor, and so it's like, is this information shared with anybody else? No, it's stored on our virtual private perimeter inside Azure. Can anybody else hit it? No, nobody can hit it. Can Microsoft themselves look at the data set? No, Microsoft themselves cannot look at it. Can it ask me a question, answer a question outside the data set? No, it can't answer a question outside the data set. So like I said, I think when we're using LLM as the public to get feedback, we're allowed to see the raw model and we see all these hallucinogenics. But the commercial version that you can run for a bank doesn't have. They have solved a lot. They appear to have solved all these problems out of the gates. I didn't try and stress test it and prove it was broken, but they demonstrated its safety. Yeah.
So Simon, a question to you regarding the architecture of all that. Are you creating, and maybe Eric as well, are you creating a model based on the domain, and that's one model associated to your data product, or are you having a large language model and you just plug in your different data products to your larger model?
So in this case, so I didn't run the experiment. So I was collaborating with a data scientist who's heavily involved in the data mesh, and he was doing a proof of concept, and he presented his work and he showed the work and explained to me, and we had a conversation. So this is not my work in presenting. He showed me the architecture diagram and he showed me all the cool things. He showed me the Python, right? And so what it was is literally he did a live demo. He said, let's look at your LinkedIn profile. I will PDF your LinkedIn profile. I will drop it into a bucket, a Lambda file, and it will ingest and train the model and have now your PDF as part of the sets. It will work in 3 seconds. Now I ask a question. Tell me something interesting about the career of Simon Massey. And it would summarize my LinkedIn profile in 3 sentences, right? So you're literally incrementally retraining the last couple of levels of launch. So it has all the LLM model to understand everything you're asking, and now it had 40 meg and incrementally growing of additional information it's ingesting. And when you ask it questions, it could detect whether the answer is coming from its previous training, what is the president of the United States, or whether it's coming from its new training, right? And it will say, I'm not going to answer a question. I've used my pre-training to understand your question, but only if I'm only going to answer from this additional data set, this 40 gigabytes worth of data. So exactly how it worked, but I was amazed. It was like, wow, that solves a safety problem, hallucination problem straight away. Right?
Yeah, we're veering in quite a different direction. So in the spirit of data mesh, data products being having very clear boundaries and very clear owners, the owners define who has access to it. And the way we manifest that is, do you have a role that gives you permission to actually access that data product? So what we do is we typically, whether it's an identity book of record and some OAuth 2 capability, what we do is when you issue the request, the question, okay, you're asking, first off, you found your data product, for example, and now you're asking a question of the data product. We actually do the security check. We anticipate doing the security check, the OAuth 2, the identity verification, before we actually execute the query. So what you have is a chatbot type interface in front, hitting an API, and that API, the first thing it does is it gets the query, but then it says you're going to data product precipitation. Do you have permission to go get it? If you do, then we execute the query, and it goes through the vector database and all the rest of the stuff. Our vector databases are not monolithic, so it's not everything in there. You can do it that way, but you end up having to do a fair amount. First off, you're violating the federated principle that Zhamak has highlighted by having a centralized vector database. You don't want to do that. So all of our data products have an accompanying vector database that you can only access if you have the role and permission to do it. And hence, if you can get by the security checks, you can actually ask any question you wish.
And does it actually run a query? So if I asked a question, tell me what the rainfall changes are between weekdays and weekends in Paris over the last 5 years, and is there some deviation that might suggest human behavior? Is that something they can just go away and go, yeah, I found your data set and I've generated a query and I've run a query and I come back with this concrete answer and a chart?
Eventually, but not initially. So we're doing a test and learn approach, and it's relatively new. So kind of step-by-step iterations. The very first step is the stuff I've mentioned, the summarization. So if you think about the data product, what we do is we expose the summary of it and the owner who about it and any other metadata associated with it. But we don't actually have access, again, using the climate thing. All we have is we're like a DNS. We point to the actual data while containing the metadata, so you can actually figure out, to find the right data product. So eventually what we'll want to do is perhaps be able to ingest some of that information, perhaps in real time, depending on how big the data source, and ask queries live. But that has a lot of problems associated with latency issues. So we're not at the point where we want to consider that. It's something open for suggestion, but we see some challenges, at least in the climate, with the constraints that we have in our climate model. It's probably not a practical option. With corporate data, there's a lot more flexibility, and that we are considering that, but we're starting to get the walk. We're going to walk before we run, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I know we don't have an answer to this, but I think the question keeps becoming, who do we point this at? Like, who do we point it at, and what do we say to them? But yeah, Yulia, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I have a short question. Eric, what stack do you using behind it? Which data stack are you using behind it? Like we're
using, so our vector database is Chroma, but we're using LangChain, by the way. So whether I use Chroma or Pinecone or anything else, it really doesn't matter. That's easily switchable. And by using LangChain, we tend to do all of our demos with OpenAI because it's the easiest to use, to be honest with you. And then we switch over to an open source model, or a local. For our corporate clients, we use local models. It's an open source model, runs inside the four walls of the entity so that no data can escape. But for our public, the climate stuff, we use open source where we can, OpenAI for demos.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a path of least resistance, actually, is what we're taking.
And I've got a couple of quick comments from Zhamak. I actually just talked with her on this yesterday, which is like, there's so much promise here, but we need to get it so that not large language models, smaller language models, moderate language models, right, can still have the same benefits, because otherwise large language models really benefit the people who have a ton of data. And so it becomes even more of a competitive advantage, and it creates more incentive for people to suck up data that they shouldn't and just collect as much data as they can on folks. And that she's really, really concerned about the garbage in, garbage out. But JGP and I were talking about, like, there's some really interesting things about pointing this at your data producers at the platform level to help them create different things, or like, hey, does my data product interconnect well with other data product, or like I'm trying to do this in this way. What are the, like, help me discover the interconnectivity ways of doing this. Do you have other ways that this might work? And it's going to come back with bad ideas, like 70% bad ideas, but 30% are good. And somebody who actually understands data can become like, it can be that like interesting leverage point. So JGP, I wanted to make sure you get a word in edgewise too. I know I said I was going to shut up and then didn't. So
no, it's fine. It's fine. There's a private joke between Scott and I, because I've got fireflies taking notes, and it gives a percentage of time of everybody speaking, and Scott holds the record. But I think Simon and Eric, they're probably good competitors here in the game. But I think so. One thing which I got from all that, which I really love, is that limiting the scope to the domain. Okay, so when you're thinking data products, okay, you're limiting the scope to the domain. If you've got your federated governance in place correctly with the right policies, you should be able to interrogate the data right in a right way. Okay, when I'm hearing Eric about the roles and things like that, that's a great story. Then the thing is, as you were kind of saying, is we're talking to a mesh. Okay, so we are talking, it's not you're talking to just one data product, but you're talking to a mesh of data product, and that's where it starts to be really interesting, where you can drive, you can pull. Okay, and if your data product is kind of shielding another one, where it starts to be really interesting is what weight does the shielded one has over the shielding one, for example. Okay, I'm talking precipitation in France, but the data is coming from Brazil and Spain. Okay, does it know that north of Spain and France should be kind of similar precipitation or whatever? Okay, so that's where it starts to be. That's kind of interesting, but it's still where I think we lack. It's a beginning, but the thing is, well, it lacks a little bit of creativity. Is that okay? We can use it to summarize data, and we can use it to generate some SQL and generate exploration data, but it's not. We're early on, but I'm kind of I'd like to know the future. What other creativity, and I'm not saying what you guys did is not impressive. It is really impressive. I just want what's next step. Okay, so
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're not ready to
stab.
point it at the CEO, right? We're not ready to say, hey,
you got a good CEO.
Yeah, well, hey, board members, in the boardroom, we're going to ask live to the internal LLM, and it's going to give us, you have that with people doing like senior analysts in the boardroom, and it's like they can't pull this data live. You expect this thing that doesn't really understand context to do it live. So yeah, I don't think we're ready. Yeah,
Sorry, I genuinely saw somebody say they come from a Gartner conference and they discovered there's going to be a new role called prompt engineer, and people are going to have to hire a chief prompt engineer. And I'm just like, why can't you learn to prompt the AI yourself? Why do you have to hire this super specialized person who's guarding all the specialists? And you say, I want to know something, and they have to like talk to the LLM to give you the answer. It just seemed a bit absurd, but hey. Yeah,
I mean, here, Jean-Georges, and here's been my experience, and I've been doing this for 5-6 months now. Is the world's changing literally the moment I get a solution out. There's a new way to do it. This is the only mode of operation you can possibly be successful at is exploration, experimentation, a test and learn approach. And again, like Simon mentioned, it was the code interpreter I'm pretty sure you're talking about. That blew me away. Just like, when the very first time I tried to interact with ChatGPT blew me away. I can't wait to see what happens next. But here's my other, and Jean-Georges knows kind of my consulting philosophy, is the opportunity for us is if we're, in this case,